James Walker wanted peace, but the HOA had other plans. When drones began spying on his farm, he fought back. What started as surveillance turned into sabotage, and soon, a courtroom showdown that would change everything. James Walker had always dreamed of a life away from the constraints of modern society, where he could wake up to the sounds of nature instead of honking cars and HOA complaint letters. A former radio communications engineer, he had spent 2 decades designing signal systems before cashing out and purchasing 50 acres of land in rural Texas. His land, his rules, that was the plan. The property was perfect. Rolling hills, open pastures, and a sturdy ranch house that he had reinforced with his own hands. It was a haven of independence, a sanctuary where he could raise horses, grow his own food, and live by the sweat of his brow. However, trouble had a way of creeping in, even in the most remote corners of the world. Less than a mile from his property lay an affluent, gated community, a neighborhood that prided itself on its pristine lawns, uniform architecture, and an overbearing homeowners association, HOA. At its head stood Bob Cartwright, a man who ruled the HOA with the same smug authority as a dictator governing his personal fiefdom. Bob believed in control, in absolute uniformity, and in his ability to dictate the fate of anything within a 5-mile radius. As far as he was concerned, James's ranch, his untamed, sprawling expanse of independence, was an eyesore, a blemish on the perfect landscape he had curated. At first, James noticed nothing unusual. He was too busy tending to his horses, repairing fencing, and enjoying the solitude of his land. But then came the drones. At first, there was only one, hovering high above his barn, barely noticeable against the vast Texas sky. James dismissed it as a nosy neighbor's toy. Then another appeared a few days later, lingering uncomfortably close to his bedroom window. He stepped outside, shading his eyes against the sun, watching as the tiny machine loitered for a moment before darting away like a cowardly spy caught in the act. Then, the harassment escalated. More drones appeared, circling over his property at odd hours, sometimes at night. They weren't just flying aimlessly. They were scouting. The horses became restless, their ears flicking back at the unnatural buzzing. One evening, while James was cleaning his tools, he spotted 3 of them lined up like vultures, surveying his land from different angles. His suspicions were confirmed when he received a thick, official-looking envelope in the mail. Stamped with the HOA's logo, the letter inside made absurd demands. Your property's aesthetic disrupts the harmony of the community. Your livestock must be contained in enclosures that meet HOA safety standards. Your structures, including your barn and fencing, are in violation of zoning codes. James laughed out loud, standing on his porch as he read the letter. This had to be a joke. His land was private property, legally outside of HOA jurisdiction. Yet, here was Bob Cartwright, acting as if his little suburban kingdom extended beyond its gates. Folding the letter neatly, James fed it straight into his wood chipper, watching the paper shred into fine confetti that fluttered away into the wind. If Bob thought he was the kind of man to roll over and comply, he had severely underestimated him. But something told him this wasn't over. No, this was just the beginning. The next few days confirmed what James had already suspected. This wasn't just harmless surveillance or some overzealous neighbor testing out a new gadget. It was organized, intentional, and far more invasive than he had imagined. The drones didn't just hover anymore, they patrolled. One morning, while tending to his horses, James watched as a sleek black drone glided slowly over his property, pausing above his water trough before zipping toward his barn. It was too calculated, too methodical to be random. His frustration grew when the pattern became obvious. The drones followed specific flight paths, covering every inch of his land in careful sweeps, as if someone was mapping out his entire ranch. They appeared at dawn, lingered near his stables, and often returned at night. His security cameras caught several of them hovering near his windows, as if trying to peek inside. By the end of the week, James knew who was behind it. The confirmation came in the form of a second letter from the HOA, this one more aggressive than the first. It has come to our attention that your property continues to violate multiple community standards. Your livestock, unkempt fields, and general property condition negatively impact surrounding homes. If corrective actions are not taken within 30 days, further steps will be pursued. No signature, no specific details, just the same empty legalese, the same veiled threats dressed up as community guidelines. James crumpled the letter in his fist, shaking his head. Then, things escalated. That evening, while enjoying a beer on his porch, James noticed a white HOA-branded SUV idling at the edge of his property line. The driver, a smug-looking man in his 50s wearing sunglasses despite the dimming light, appeared to be taking notes, occasionally glancing up at the house. James took a long sip from his bottle before setting it down and casually walking toward the SUV. As soon as he did, the vehicle lurched forward and sped away, leaving a trail of dust behind. "All right, Bob, if that's how you want to play it." The next morning, James found that someone had cut the chain on his pasture gate, allowing his horses to wander dangerously close to the main road. Fortunately, his animals were trained well enough not to stray too far. But it was a clear message. Someone was testing his patience, seeing how much they could push before he reacted. By midday, another issue surfaced. His water pressure had dropped to a trickle. A quick check of his main valve revealed a red HOA notice taped to it, stating that his system was under review for non-compliance with safety standards. That was complete nonsense. His water was from a well, independent of the city supply. He was being sabotaged. That evening, James did something he rarely did. He drove straight into enemy territory. The gated HOA community was exactly what he expected. Perfectly manicured lawns, identical houses with beige exteriors, and an air of rigid uniformity that reeked of artificiality. It made his skin crawl, but he wasn't here to admire the scenery. He pulled up to the HOA's community office, marched inside, and slammed the cut chain and the red notice onto the receptionist's desk. "Tell Bob Cartwright that if he wants to threaten me, he better do it to my face." The receptionist, a nervous-looking woman in her 40s, gave him a tight-lipped smile and mumbled something about Bob not being available. James let out a slow breath, suppressing the urge to laugh. Bob was a coward, a manipulative, passive-aggressive coward who hid behind bureaucracy and drones instead of confronting his problems like a man. As he walked out of the office, James noticed something that made his blood simmer with quiet rage. A row of high-tech drones sitting neatly on a shelf behind the receptionist's desk, all marked with HOA property stickers. "So it's official. You're spying on me." James knew then that this was more than just harassment. This was a war. James wasn't the type to let a bunch of power-hungry suburban bureaucrats push him around. But it was becoming clear that Bob Cartwright and his HOA weren't going to back off. The drone surveillance was bad enough, but now they had escalated to direct sabotage. The morning after his visit to the HOA office, James found a fresh surprise waiting for him. A row of concrete barriers blocking his main access gate. Someone had gone through the trouble of hauling over massive blocks and dumping them right in front of his property's entrance, making it impossible for him to drive in or out. A laminated sign taped to one of the blocks read, "Service road closed. Community Safety Initiative." James let out a humorless chuckle. Service road? This was his damn driveway. The sheer audacity of these people was almost impressive. Without missing a beat, James walked back to his house, grabbed his phone, and made a call. An hour later, a friend from a nearby ranch showed up with his industrial-sized forklift. The neighbors from the HOA might have expected James to call the city, file a complaint, or beg them to remove the barriers. Instead, he did something much simpler. He lifted each concrete block, one by one, and neatly stacked them directly in front of the HOA's office entrance. If you're going to dump trash on my land, I'll return the favor. The HOA's receptionist and a few community members watched in horror as the last block slammed into place, completely blocking their door. James dusted off his hands, nodded in satisfaction, and drove home without a word. Later that night, as James was securing the barn, his horses started acting skittish. Their ears flicked back, tails twitching. Something was off. Then he heard it, a low hissing sound coming from near his water pumps. Heart pounding, he grabbed his flashlight and rushed over, only to find that someone had tampered with his irrigation system. The pipes had been slashed open, water gushing out onto the dry earth. Son of a... James immediately shut off the main valve, cutting the flow before more damage could be done. This wasn't just pettiness. This was intentional destruction of property. And then came the police. As James was inspecting the damage, a pair of squad cars rolled up his driveway, their headlights cutting through the darkness. He wiped his wet hands on his jeans and crossed his arms as two officers stepped out. "Mr. Walker?" one of them called. "Yeah. What's this about?" The younger officer glanced at his notepad. "We received a report that you were engaging in aggressive behavior toward members of the community." James let out a bark of laughter. Aggressive behavior? These HOA lunatics had trespassed on his property, destroyed his irrigation, and blocked his damn driveway. But he was the one they called the cops on? "Officers, I think you got it backward," James said, motioning toward the slashed pipes. "I've been dealing with sabotage and harassment for weeks. I've got cameras. I've got proof." The older cop seemed to consider this. "You have security footage?" James nodded. "Crystal clear. I can show you HOA members trespassing on my land and damaging my property." There was a long pause before the officers exchanged a glance. The younger one sighed heavily and put his notepad away. "We'll need to file a report on this. Looks like there's more to the story than what we were told." James smirked. "Yeah, I'd say so." The next morning, James woke up to find flyers plastered all over the nearby roads, and even his own fence. The bold print read, "Dangerous individual in our community. Violent landowner refuses to cooperate." Each flyer had a poorly cropped, zoomed-in image of James, taken from one of the drones, making him look like some kind of outlaw. There was even a fake HOA community alert, claiming that James was violating zoning laws, and that he would soon be removed through legal action. That was the moment James realized. Bob wasn't just harassing him. He was trying to push him off his own land. "All right, Bob. Time for you to learn who you're messing with." James knew that Bob Cartwright was escalating things for a reason. The concrete barriers, the sabotage, the police reports, and now the smear campaign. It all pointed to one goal: forcing him into a legal battle on HOA's terms. Bob wasn't just a power-hungry bureaucrat. He was a strategist, someone who weaponized paperwork and regulations instead of fists. And then it happened. A thick, official-looking envelope arrived in James's mailbox, stamped with the insignia of a local district court. Inside was a lawsuit, filed by the HOA, personally signed by Bob Cartwright. James skimmed through the document, his eyes narrowing at the ridiculous charges. Violation of airspace regulations by interfering with private surveillance equipment, illegally disrupting community safety measures, endangering the residents of the neighborhood through aggressive behavior. It was so outrageous, so blatantly fabricated, that James almost laughed. They were actually trying to take him to court for jamming their drones. But Bob had played his hand carefully. The lawsuit cited an obscure state regulation about disrupting aerial monitoring equipment, implying that James's signal jammers were a criminal act. It also included a request for an injunction, meaning if the court granted it, James could be legally forced to remove all of his counter-surveillance measures. And the best part? The HOA's expert witness was a so-called airspace consultant who was on Bob's payroll. Bob was trying to drown him in bureaucracy. A drawn-out court battle would cost James time and money. The plan was simple. Make the lawsuit such a pain in the ass that James would just give up and leave. James wasn't having it. He called up a lawyer friend from his engineering days, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Rebecca Holt. She specialized in property disputes, and when she saw the lawsuit, she whistled low. This is some next-level legal bullshit, James. But you know what? I love a challenge. Rebecca quickly dug into HOA records and found a gold mine, evidence that Bob had been using HOA funds to pay for those drones. Even worse, the drones weren't legally registered with the FAA. That was illegal. Then she found something even better. A record of Bob pressuring city officials to reclassify James's land as part of the HOA's jurisdiction. A request that had been denied months ago. "Oh, Bob," James muttered with a grin. "You've really stepped in it. Now." Armed with these facts, Rebecca counterfiled a lawsuit of their own. Not just for harassment, but for illegal surveillance, fraud, and abuse of power. James wasn't just going to fight back. He was going to drag Bob Cartwright into the legal equivalent of a bar fight and leave him bleeding in the dust. The courtroom was packed. The case had gained attention, not just from local residents, but from nearby property owners who had long been fed up with HOA overreach. The judge, an older man with sharp eyes and little patience for nonsense, banged his gavel to silence the murmurs as Bob Cartwright sat smugly at the plaintiff's table, flanked by his high-priced HOA attorneys. Across from him sat James, relaxed but alert, with Rebecca Holt by his side, her sharp legal mind ready to dismantle every lie Bob had built. The HOA's lead attorney, a stiff-looking man in a tailored suit, stood and launched into a self-righteous speech about community safety and the dangers of rogue landowners who refuse to follow modern regulations. Mr. Walker has engaged in illegal activity by using unlawful signal jamming devices that disrupt critical aerial surveillance. James suppressed a laugh. Critical aerial surveillance? These people were acting like he had taken down military satellites instead of knocking a few nosy drones out of the sky. The HOA lawyer continued, now parading their so-called expert witness, a man with thick glasses and a nervous expression, who rattled off a convoluted testimony about airspace integrity and the dangers of disrupting community-approved monitoring systems. Then Bob himself took the stand. Dressed in his usual pristine attire, he turned on the false charm, trying to paint James as a dangerous outsider who threatened their peaceful community. "We tried to work with him, Your Honor. We sent him notices. We attempted civil discussions, but he has shown nothing but hostility. His actions endangered the harmony we strive for in our neighborhood." James met Bob's gaze, giving him a slow, knowing smile. He was about to watch Bob's entire case burn to the ground. Rebecca stood up and walked toward the judge. "Your Honor, let's talk about harmony. We have evidence that the HOA used unauthorized drones to spy on my client's property. These drones were not only unregistered, but were funded through HOA fees without proper disclosure to the community. The judge's eyes narrowed. Is this true, Mr. Cartwright? Bob shifted in his seat, his confident mask cracking just slightly. Our community members expect a certain level of monitoring for security purposes. Rebecca didn't let him breathe. Did you obtain consent from Mr. Walker to conduct surveillance over his property? Silence. Bob's fingers twitched on the stand. Mr. Cartwright, do you understand that unauthorized surveillance of private land is not only a violation of state privacy laws, but also a direct breach of FAA regulations? A murmur spread through the courtroom. Even the HOA lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Then, Rebecca dropped the bombshell. Your Honor, we have also uncovered attempts by the HOA present to illegally reclassify Mr. Walker's land under HOA jurisdiction. These requests were rejected by city planning officials. But Mr. Cartwright continued to act as though the land belonged to him. The judge leaned forward, his expression hard. Mr. Cartwright, is this true? Bob swallowed hard, his gaze darting toward his lawyer, who suddenly looked like he wanted to be anywhere but in that courtroom. The next few moments were a complete legal demolition. Rebecca presented emails, meeting notes, and official letters from city officials confirming Bob's attempts at legal manipulation. Then she played security footage from James's property, showing HOA members trespassing, cutting chains, and tampering with irrigation. The judge wasn't just unimpressed, he was furious. Mr. Cartwright, your association has not only engaged in illegal surveillance, but you have also actively harassed a private landowner and attempted to defraud city officials. This is not a simple property dispute. This is outright abuse of power. Bob sank lower into his seat, his face draining of color as he realized his grand plan had completely backfired. James, meanwhile, just leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, enjoying the show. The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. Bob Cartwright, once smug and confident, now looked like a man watching his empire crumble before his eyes. The judge's glare bore into him like a spotlight exposing a cockroach, and for the first time since this legal battle began, Bob seemed to fully grasp the gravity of his situation. Rebecca Holt wasn't finished. She rose from her seat, pacing slowly before turning to face the courtroom. Your Honor, given the overwhelming evidence of Mr. Cartwright's illegal surveillance, harassment, and fraudulent attempts to seize control of private land, we are filing an immediate counterclaim. Bob's lawyer shot up from his seat, flustered. Your Honor, we strongly object. These claims are exaggerated and... The judge cut him off with a raised hand. Overruled. I'm more interested in why your client lied under oath. The courtroom stirred as Bob visibly shrank, his once stiff posture now slumping under the weight of his mistakes. Then came the final blow. Rebecca pulled out a printed transcript and held it up. We have here an HOA board meeting record where Mr. Cartwright explicitly instructed members to fabricate violations against Mr. Walker. She cleared her throat and read aloud. Walker is a problem. If we can't get him to comply, we'll make his life miserable until he leaves. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Even the HOA board members in attendance looked horrified. Bob turned pale as a sheet. His lawyer visibly clenched his jaw, probably calculating just how much of a career-ending disaster this was turning into. The judge leaned forward, his voice dangerously low. Mr. Cartwright, you have given me no choice but to rule in favor of Mr. Walker. Bob gripped the edges of the table, his knuckles white. Furthermore, your actions constitute fraudulent misrepresentation, unlawful surveillance, and abuse of power under state law. The ruling was swift and merciless. The HOA was ordered to pay $150,000 in damages to James Walker. Bob Cartwright was personally fined and removed from his position as HOA president. A formal review of the HOA's practices was ordered, with potential criminal charges looming. Bob looked like a man who had just been hit by a freight train. His face twitched as he turned to his lawyer, as if hoping for some miracle escape, but there was none. James simply smirked, watching as Bob's world came crashing down around him. The fallout from the trial was swift and brutal. The once feared Bob Cartwright, who had ruled over the HOA like a king, was now a disgraced man with nowhere to hide. The local news picked up the story, and soon his name became synonymous with corruption and HOA abuse. Residents of the gated community, many of whom had feared speaking out against Bob for years, celebrated his downfall. Some even began filing their own complaints against the HOA, demanding refunds for misused funds and calling for a complete restructuring of the board. And Bob? He wasn't just removed from his position. He was forced to sell his house and leave the community he had once controlled. James, meanwhile, enjoyed every second of Bob's final humiliation. On the day Bob moved out, James made sure to set up a lawn chair near his driveway, sipping on a cold beer as Bob angrily loaded boxes into his car. "Need help packing, Bob?" James called out, grinning. Bob shot him a glare that could melt steel, but said nothing. His lawyer had likely told him to keep his mouth shut, lest he dig himself an even deeper hole. As Bob slammed the trunk of his car, one of his former HOA allies, an older woman who had once been his staunchest supporter, walked up to him. "Good riddance," she muttered, tossing a printed copy of the court ruling onto his windshield. The final insult came as his car rolled down the street. James had set up a giant wooden sign right outside the HOA entrance. It read, "Now, a HOA-free zone. No drones, no tyrants, no Bob." Laughter erupted from the gathered crowd. Bob, his face red with humiliation, sped off without looking back. James tipped his hat and took another sip of beer. "That's how you take down a dictator,"